The church doors slammed open so hard the iron handles gouged the plaster wall, and every mourner in the front pew turned at once. A man stood in the doorway with the afternoon sun behind him, dust spinning in the light, the silhouette of a wide-brimmed hat and a long black coat that did not move with the wind. He took one step inside, and the priest stopped mid-prayer. Under the open coat, beneath a tailored suit jacket, the worn leather of a gun belt caught a glint of candlelight. Nobody breathed. Nobody reached for a weapon, though every man in that church carried one. He walked down the center aisle alone. No guards, no driver, no second car waiting outside, and the polished casket at the altar seemed to pull him forward like a magnet. They called him El Sereno, the calm one, and he had not been invited. So why had he come? Stay with me on this one. To understand why a single man walking into a church could freeze 200 armed men in place, you have to understand what that church meant on that particular afternoon. The town was Santa Rosa de Lima, a dust-colored place tucked into the mountains of northern Mexico, the kind of town where the gas station closes at 8 and the only stoplight blinks yellow forever. For most of the year, Santa Rosa was nothing. It was a name on a map. But for 3 days in the autumn of 2009, Santa Rosa was the most dangerous square mile on the continent. The man in the casket was Don Hilario Mendoza Cuvas, known to everyone in the trade simply as El Patron. He had been the founder and lifelong leader of the Mendoza organization, a smuggling network that had moved cocaine, marijuana, and migrants across the border for almost 40 years. He was 68 when he died, peacefully in his sleep at his ranch outside Culiacan, which was a death almost no one in his profession ever achieved. His family announced the funeral would take place in Santa Rosa because that was the village where he had been born and where the small adobe chapel of San Miguel still stood at the end of the main road. The funeral was supposed to be private, family only. But the moment word leaked, every faction with a stake in the Mendoza territory began to move. Within a day, the high passes around Santa Rosa filled with black SUVs, armored pickup trucks, and convoys flying no flags but carrying enough firepower to take a small city. The Sinaloa faction sent a delegation under one of El Patron's old lieutenants, a man named Rufino, who had been promised the Pacific Corridor in some private deal nobody could verify. The Gulf faction sent two cousins of the dead man, both lawyers by training, both rumored to be next in line for the Tamaulipas plazas. The Beltrancel sent a younger boss named Santiago, who arrived in a convoy of 9 trucks and brought along his own personal mariachi band, which he kept playing in the village square to remind everyone he was there. And then there were the Zetas. The Zetas were the new variable, the ones nobody had figured out how to handle yet. They were former Special Forces soldiers turned smugglers, trained in counterinsurgency by foreign instructors. They had spent the last 2 years carving out their own territory by methods so brutal the older organizations could not bring themselves to copy them. The Zetas had not been invited. The Zetas did not care. A column of their trucks had taken up positions on the ridge north of town the night before. The local police had simply driven away. The day before the funeral, the chief of the municipal force loaded his family into a truck, drove down the mountain, and never came back. The army announced it would be conducting unrelated training exercises in a different state. The federal police issued a statement saying jurisdiction was unclear. By the morning of the funeral, the only law in Santa Rosa was the unwritten kind, the kind enforced by whoever had the most guns and the longest memory. Inside the chapel, the seating arrangement was a war map disguised as a guest list. The Mendoza family sat in the first 3 pews on the right, dressed in formal black, their faces drawn but composed. Behind them sat the Sinaloa delegation, 12 men in dark suits, all of them strangers to the family but blood relatives to the dead man's old crew. On the left side, the Gulf cousins occupied the front pew, and behind them sat Santiago and the Beltran men, their hats in their laps. The middle aisle was empty by agreement. No one walked it. The aisle was the line, and everyone understood that crossing it without permission would be the same as drawing a weapon. The priest who stood at the altar that day was Father Octavio Lara, an old man of 74 who had baptized El Patron as an infant and had buried both of his parents in the cemetery behind the chapel. He had refused to leave when the soldiers and bosses started arriving. The bishop had called him personally to suggest he take a vacation. Father Octavio had laughed and said the dead man deserved a funeral, and he was the only priest in 300 kilometers who had known the dead man as a child. So he stayed. He wore his oldest vestments, the ones with the gold thread frayed at the cuffs. The service began on time. Father Octavio chanted the opening prayers in a voice that did not shake. The mourners responded in Latin, every voice careful, every head bowed at exactly the right moment. For the first 20 minutes, you might have believed you were watching a real funeral, the kind where grief was the only weapon in the room. And then the doors at the back of the church slammed open, and a man nobody had invited stepped inside. He was not a tall man. People who tried to remember him later always wanted to make him tall, because in their memories, he loomed larger than the doorway. In fact, he stood about 5'9". He was wiry rather than thick, with the build of a man who had spent his early life climbing into truck beds and his middle years learning to sit very still in the back of armored cars. His face was clean-shaven that morning, a small detail people noticed because he was famous for the short black beard he had worn for 20 years. He had shaved it off before the funeral, which meant the funeral was not improvised. He had planned it. Everyone in that church recognized him within 2 seconds. The man walking up the center aisle was Octavio Salinas Marquez, known throughout the trade as El Sereno, the boss of the Pacific North Syndicate, the only major organization in the country that had not sent a delegation to the funeral. He was the one nobody had been able to read. He had refused every overture. He had sent no flowers, no telegram, no proxy. 3 different intermediaries had reached out to his ranch above Mazatlan, and all 3 had been turned away politely at the gate. The general assumption was that El Sereno had decided to sit the war out, that he was going to let the Sinaloa, Gulf, Beltran, and Zeta factions tear each other apart over the Mendoza territory and then sweep up the survivors. It was a strategy that made sense for him. It was also a strategy that meant he should not have been there. But there he was, walking up the empty aisle, his boots making a soft tap on the tile, the gun belt visible to anyone who looked carefully but the holster itself empty. He had come unarmed. That detail traveled through the church faster than his name had. The men in the front pews saw it first, the leather pouch at his hip flat and slack, no pistol grip rising from it, no spare magazines tucked into the loops along the belt. The belt was a costume, or it was a message. In either case, it meant he had walked into a building containing roughly 200 armed men, half of whom would have happily killed him on sight, and he had not bothered to bring a weapon of his own. Rufino, the Sinaloa lieutenant in the third pew on the right, slowly moved his right hand to the inside of his jacket and then, just as slowly, moved it back to his lap. Across the aisle, one of the Gulf cousins did the same thing in reverse, lowering a hand that had already started reaching. Santiago, in the fourth pew on the left, did not move at all, but the muscles along his jaw locked so hard you could see them from 3 rows back. Father Octavio kept chanting. He did not stop. He did not even look up. His voice rose and fell in the old Latin cadence, and the censer in his hand swung in slow, even arcs. He was the only person in the building who seemed not to notice that the world had just changed. El Sereno reached the front of the church. He did not look at the family. He did not look at the lieutenants in the pews on either side. He stopped about 3 meters from the casket and stood there for a moment with his hands at his sides, and then he did something that no one in the building had been prepared for. He removed his hat. He held it against his chest with both hands, the wide brim crushed slightly between his fingers, and he lowered his head. It was the gesture of a son at his father's grave, of a soldier at the funeral of his commanding officer, of a man honoring a debt nobody else in the room had known about. For a long moment he just stood there, hat against his chest, head bowed. Father Octavio finished a verse and paused for breath. The pause stretched. The chapel was so quiet you could hear the candles burning, the small wet sound of wax sliding down the brass holders, the faint creak of a wooden pew as someone shifted weight. El Sereno raised his head. He took 2 more steps forward until he was directly beside the casket. He laid one hand flat on the polished wood. He kept it there for a count of perhaps 5 seconds. And then slowly, with the care of a man whose knees were no longer young, he lowered himself onto the kneeler at the foot of the altar, made the sign of the cross, and began to pray. The room sat in stunned silence. The Sinaloa men did not know what to do. The Gulf cousins exchanged a look across the aisle that contained an entire encyclopedia of confused calculation. Santiago lowered his head, partly in confusion, partly because the only safe response when you do not know what is happening is to look like you are praying too. On the ridge north of town, the Zeta lookouts radioed back to their commander that El Sereno had walked in unarmed and was now kneeling at the casket. The commander, a man known only as Z9, took a long pause and then ordered his column to hold position. El Sereno prayed for what those who were there later said felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 4 minutes. His lips moved. His eyes were closed. His hat rested on the kneeler beside him. And in those 4 minutes, 200 armed men in a small adobe chapel in Santa Rosa de Lima held their breath and waited for whatever was about to happen next, because every one of them knew that the man kneeling at that casket had not come to mourn. He had come to say something. And whatever he was about to say was going to decide whether the next year of their lives was a war or a peace. He stood up. He picked up his hat. He turned to face the congregation, and for the first time in his life, every powerful man in the Mexican drug trade was sitting in front of him at the same moment, looking at him, waiting. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The chapel was small enough, and the silence was complete enough that even a whisper would have reached the back wall. He spoke first to Father Octavio in a tone of polite apology. He asked the priest's permission to address the mourners for a short time before the service continued. Father Octavio looked at him for a long moment, the old man's eyes unreadable behind the thick lenses of his glasses, and then nodded once. El Sereno turned back to the room. He thanked the family. He named each of El Patron's children by their full names, slowly, in the formal style of an old village elder, and he offered each of them his condolences. The widow, sitting in the front pew, lowered her head and began to weep silently for the first time since the service had begun. Her name was Dona Mercedes, and she had not allowed herself to cry in public for 40 years. Now she cried. Then El Sereno turned and faced the lieutenants. He did not single anyone out. He spoke to all of them at once, the Sinaloa men and the Gulf cousins and Santiago and his Beltran captains, and by extension, through the open chapel door and across the dust of the courtyard, the Zeta lookouts on the ridge to the north. He said he had known El Patron for 41 years. He said they had met as boys, both of them working as lookouts for a small marijuana operation run out of a town 2 valleys west, both of them paid in pesos and tortillas. He said El Patron had once, when they were 19, given him his own jacket on a freezing night in the mountains because El Sereno had not brought one, and was shaking so hard he could not hold a rifle steady. He said the jacket had saved his life that night, and he had owed El Patron a debt ever since, and he had come to the funeral to pay it. If you have been with me this far, please subscribe to the channel. We tell true stories like this one every week, the ones that didn't make the headlines but changed everything in places where the headlines didn't reach. Subscribing is free. It takes 1 second, and it helps me find more of these forgotten histories and bring them to you. Now back to the chapel. He continued speaking. He said that everyone in the room had a claim. He named the claims, one by one, with a precision that startled the men whose claims they were. He named the Pacific Corridor and the Tamaulipas plazas, and the Veracruz ports and the Chihuahua high passes. He named the routes through Sonora that El Patron had personally opened in the early 80s. He named the airstrips in the desert and the warehouses in Monterrey, and the tunnel network under the Tijuana fence that El Patron had financed in 1996. He spoke of these things the way a notary reads a will, with no emotion and no judgment, just the careful enumeration of property that now belonged to no one and would soon belong to whoever survived the fight over it. He said that he had spent the last 2 weeks doing the math. He had been in his ranch above Mazatlan, with his maps and his ledgers and his oldest advisors, and he had calculated what a war over the Mendoza territory would actually cost. He had calculated the dead. He had calculated the burned villages and the blocked highways and the tourist hotels that would empty out and the foreign investment that would dry up. He had calculated the response from the federal government, which would be forced to send the army into half a dozen states at once, which would mean checkpoints, which would mean inspections, which would mean every smuggling route in the north would be choked for at least 18 months. He had calculated the response from the Americans, who would tighten the border, freeze accounts, and pressure the Mexican president to accept the kind of joint operations no one in the trade wanted. And he had calculated, finally, the response from the regular people of northern Mexico, the farmers and the school teachers and the shopkeepers, who would, for the first time in a generation, begin to organize against the cartels in a way that no amount of money could buy off. The math, he said, was simple. A war would cost everyone in the room more than they could possibly gain. Even the winner of such a war, if a winner could be said to exist, would inherit a smoking ruin patrolled by foreign agents and watched by a public that had finally lost its patience. There would be no Pacific Corridor worth running. There would be no Tamaulipas plazas worth holding. There would be no plaza at all, just a long, exhausting, expensive collapse. He let that sink in. He looked around the room. He looked at Rufino and at the Gulf cousins and at Santiago, and even at the open back door through which the Zeta lookouts could see if they cared to. And then he said the thing that nobody in that chapel had expected, the thing that, when it was repeated later, would travel from village to village across northern Mexico for the next 10 years, the thing that would later be carved in small letters above the door of the chapel itself. He said, "I did not come here to ask for territory. I came here to give some away." The proposal he laid out over the next 20 minutes was so unusual that even the men who had been in the trade for decades had to ask him to repeat parts of it. He spoke slowly. He used the chapel itself, the rows of pews, the candles on the altar, the painted saints on the walls, as a kind of map, gesturing here and there to indicate the regions he was naming. He had clearly rehearsed the speech, but he delivered it without notes and without any sign of strain, the way a teacher might explain long division to a class that had been struggling with it for weeks. The first part of the proposal was a moratorium. He said that for the next 12 months, no organization represented in the chapel would move a single shipment, kill a single rival, or expand into a single new plaza. Routes would freeze where they were. Bosses would freeze where they were. The territory of the Mendoza organization, which everyone had come to fight over, would be placed under the temporary administration of a council of 3 respected elders chosen by the family itself, none of whom were active in the trade. The council would oversee the existing operations, and would distribute the existing revenue according to a formula based on the headcount and historical contribution of each faction. This would not be a permanent arrangement. It would last exactly 1 year. The second part of the proposal was a meeting. He said that at the end of that year, the bosses of the major organizations, including those not present in the chapel that day, would gather at a neutral site he had already arranged, and they would negotiate a permanent division of the Mendoza territory among themselves. He said the negotiations would be witnessed by a Catholic bishop, 2 former federal judges he had already spoken to, and a representative from each of the 4 major U.S. wholesale buyers, whose presence would guarantee that whatever was agreed to would actually be honored. He said the negotiations would last as long as they needed to last, and that he himself would not take part in them, because he wanted no piece of the Mendoza territory, and he wanted everyone in the room to understand that. The third part of the proposal was the hardest. He said that any organization that violated the moratorium during the 12 months, or that walked away from the negotiations at the end of the year, would be cut off. He did not threaten violence. He did not have to. He said that the Pacific North Syndicate, his own organization, controlled roughly 70% of the precursor chemical supply for the entire northern half of the country, and he said that any group that broke the agreement would simply find that the trucks no longer arrived, that the chemists no longer answered their phones, that the shipments from Asia somehow always got delayed at the port of Manzanillo. He said it in the tone of a man explaining the weather. There was no menace in his voice. There was just the steady, calm enumeration of consequence. He named the council of 3 elders. The first was a retired schoolteacher from Culiacan, a man in his late 70s who had taught half the older bosses in the room when they had been boys. The second was a Carmelite nun from Hermosillo, who had run a hospice for the families of the disappeared for the last 20 years, and who had refused, on principle, to take money from any of the cartels even when her hospice was on the verge of closing. The third was a former state senator from Sonora, who had retired in disgrace 10 years earlier after refusing to sign a piece of legislation that would have benefited every organization represented in the chapel. All 3 were known to everyone present. All 3 were considered incorruptible, not because they were saints, but because they had spent their entire lives demonstrating that they could not be bought. He named the neutral site for the meeting at the end of the year. It was a hot springs resort in the mountains of Jalisco, a place owned by a Spanish family that had no connection to any organization in the trade, a place with a single road in and out that could be easily watched and easily cleared. He had already paid the deposit. He had already reserved the entire facility for 2 weeks. The booking was in his own name, and the receipt, he said, was in his coat pocket if anyone wanted to see it. He named the 4 U.S. wholesale buyers. He did not give their full names, but he gave enough detail that everyone in the room understood exactly who he meant. 2 of them were in Los Angeles. 1 was in Houston. 1 was in Chicago. All 4 had agreed to send representatives. All 4 had agreed in advance to honor whatever division was reached. He said the Americans had been told that the alternative was a year of supply chaos that would push street prices up by 40% and force the buyers themselves into a war among their own crews. The Americans had decided that they preferred peace. Then he stopped. He held his hat against his chest again. He said he was finished. He said he would now return to his seat at the back of the chapel and would let Father Octavio finish the funeral in peace. He said he asked for no answer that day. He asked only that each of the men in the room go back to their bosses and discuss what they had heard and send word to his ranch within 7 days. If the answer was yes, the moratorium would begin at midnight on the 7th day. If the answer was no, then he wished each man in the room good luck and a long life, and he would pray for them. He bowed once to the family. He bowed once to Father Octavio. He turned and walked back down the center aisle, his hat still pressed against his chest, and stepped out into the white afternoon sunlight. A black sedan was waiting. He climbed into the back seat. The car pulled away. The funeral resumed. Father Octavio finished the Mass. The mourners filed out into the courtyard, past the whitewashed walls and the bougainvillea and the small stone fountain, and they stood in clusters of 2 and 3 and 4, talking quietly, their faces still slack with the shock of what they had just heard. The Sinaloa men spoke to the Sinaloa men. The Gulf cousins spoke to each other. Santiago and his captain stood near their trucks and spoke to no one. On the ridge to the north, the Zeta column slowly mounted up and pulled out, leaving a long ribbon of dust hanging in the air. By sundown, Santa Rosa de Lima was empty again. The 7 days passed. Within 5 days, every organization had sent word to the ranch above Mazatlan. The answer in every case was yes. The answer was yes from the Sinaloa faction, who had calculated that a year of frozen roots would still leave them in a stronger position than a year of war. The answer was yes from the Gulf cousins, who privately confessed to one another that they had no appetite for a fight against the Zetas and had been looking for an excuse to back away. The answer was yes from Santiago, who said only that he would honor the moratorium because he had been raised by a mother who taught him to honor the dead. The answer was yes, finally, from the Zetas, delivered through an intermediary in a Monterey restaurant by a man who did not give his name, but who handed over a folded piece of paper with the single word agreed written on it in pencil. The moratorium began at midnight on the 7th day. It held. For the next 12 months, the roots did not move, the bosses did not move, and the Council of 3 elders, after their initial astonishment at being chosen, accepted the responsibility and administered the Mendoza territory with a quiet competence that surprised everyone. The retired schoolteacher kept the books. The Carmelite nun managed the distribution of revenue, with a portion of each month's collection going, by her own insistence, to the families of those killed in the previous year of fighting. The former state senator handled communication between the families and the bosses, traveling from town to town in an old pickup truck with no escort. None of the 3 was harmed during the year. Word had gone out that anyone who touched any of the 3 would be dealt with by every organization in the country at once, and that word, for once, was believed. The negotiations at the hot springs began on schedule. They lasted 11 days. The bishop attended. The 2 former judges attended. The 4 representatives from the U.S. buyers attended. The bosses attended in person. El Sereno did not attend. He sent a single observer, a young accountant from his ranch, with instructions to take notes and to report back but to participate in nothing. The division of the Mendoza territory that emerged from those 11 days was complicated, but it was honored. The Sinaloa faction received the Pacific Corridor. The Gulf cousins received the Tamaulipas plazas. Santiago and the Beltran organization received the Veracruz ports. The Zetas received the Chihuahua high passes, which was less than they had wanted but more than they had expected. Nothing went to El Sereno. The peace held for almost 6 years. From late 2009 through the middle of 2015, northern Mexico experienced the longest period of relative quiet in its modern history. Killings did not stop entirely, of course, but they dropped by a measurable amount in every state north of Mexico City. Tourist towns reopened. Foreign investment returned. The federal government claimed credit for the calm. Nobody outside the trade knew what had actually happened in the small adobe chapel in Santa Rosa de Lima on that autumn afternoon. The journalists who eventually pieced it together did so years later, working from leaked transcripts of intercepted phone calls, the diary of a parish housekeeper, and the deathbed confession of one of the Gulf cousins, who unburdened himself to a priest in Brownsville, Texas, in 2017. The peace eventually broke, as all such pieces eventually do, when a younger generation of bosses came up through the ranks and decided that the old arrangement no longer served them. The war that followed was as bad as El Sereno had predicted it would be in 2009, perhaps worse, and it is in many ways still going on today. But for those 6 years, in the towns and cities of northern Mexico, an enormous number of people simply lived, went to school, opened businesses, raised children, and died of ordinary causes. They never knew that they owed those quiet years to a single small wiry man in a long black coat who had walked unarmed into a funeral he had not been invited to and had spent 20 minutes explaining math. El Sereno himself lived another 14 years. He retired from active leadership of the Pacific North Syndicate in 2014. He spent his last years on the ranch above Mazatlan, raising horses, reading history, and corresponding with a small circle of friends that included a Carmelite nun in Hermosillo and a retired schoolteacher in Culiacan. He died of pancreatic cancer in the spring of 2023 at the age of 76. His funeral was small and private, attended only by his family and a handful of old associates. He was buried in the cemetery behind the chapel of San Miguel in Santa Rosa de Lima, in a plot he had purchased 20 years before, 3 rows behind the grave of Don Hilario Mendoza Cuvas. The 2 stones face each other across a narrow gravel path. They have weathered together in the mountain sun. And on certain afternoons, when the light is right, you can stand between them and almost hear the chapel doors slamming open one more time.